Here are 7 brilliant chess traps every player should know. You will love the number 3 chess trap. Let's get started. Starting off with number 7 is the Lasker Trap, which also begins in the Queen's Gambit line. Pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to c4. Black immediately challenges with pawn to e5, entering the Albin counter gambit. White usually captures the pawn on e5, and black pushes the d-pawn forward, supported by the queen. White might play pawn to e3, thinking it's a solid development move. But now black plays bishop to b4, giving check. White often responds with bishop to d2 to block, and now comes the clever part. Black captures the pawn on e3. If white grabs the bishop on b4, black captures the pawn on d2. White cannot take this pawn because black will capture the queen, so the king will go to d2 instead. Now, the brilliant move. Pawn captures on g1 and promotes to a knight, delivering check. The white king is stuck. If it tries to escape, it exposes the queen, and if it returns, queen to h4 is a crushing follow-up. There's no immediate checkmate, but the attack is relentless and gives black overwhelming pressure. Coming in with number 6 is the legal trap. This trap begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. Then comes bishop to c4 followed by pawn to d6 to support the center. White develops another knight to c3, and black brings the bishop to pin the knight on f3 to the queen. White pushes the pawn to h3, prompting the bishop to retreat, though ideally it should capture instead. But if it moves back to h5, this sets the stage. White then plays knight captures pawn on e5, essentially ignoring the pin. If black gets greedy and captures the queen, white plays bishop to f7, forcing the king to e7, followed by knight to d5. And that's checkmate. It's swift, sneaky, and extremely satisfying. An absolute classic. Here's the number 5, the Noah's Ark Trap. This classic trap comes from the Ruy Lopez and is a favorite among players who enjoy punishing overly aggressive bishops. It begins with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. After black plays pawn to a6, white retreats with bishop to a4. Then comes pawn to d6. White pushes for the center with pawn to d4, and black counters with pawn to b5. The bishop slides to b3, and now black strikes with knight captures pawn on d4. White recaptures with knight takes d4, and black trades again with pawn takes knight. White scoops it up with queen takes d4. At this point, black plays pawn to c5, chasing the queen. White retreats to queen to d5. Black develops bishop to e6, and white responds with queen to c6 check. Black blocks with bishop to d7, and white goes back to queen to d5. Now comes the trap. Black plays pawn to c4. The bishop on b3 is now completely trapped. There's nowhere safe to go, and it's only a matter of time before it's captured. Coming in at number 4 is the Blackburn Schilling Gambit Trap, which also begins with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. White plays bishop to c4, and here black sets the trap with knight to d4. This invites white to capture the pawn on e5. If white does so, black responds with queen to g5, threatening both the pawn on g2 and setting up nasty tactics. If white tries to defend with pawn to g3, they lose the knight. If they instead try knight to f7, thinking it's safe thanks to the bishop's support, black continues with queen to g2, attacking the rook. If white plays rook to f1 to defend, queen to e4 is check, and the threats become overwhelming. If they try to block or counterattack, they often fall into further traps, like bishop to e2 followed by knight to f3 check, leading to forced checkmate scenarios. This trap escalates quickly and punishes greed or carelessness. At number 3, we have the Elephant Trap, which comes from the Queen's Gambit line. It starts with pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and black declines the gambit with pawn to e6. Then white develops the knight to c3 and black plays knight to f6. White pins that knight with bishop to g5, and black solidifies the defense with knight to d7. When white captures the pawn on d5 and black recaptures, white might believe they can win a pawn by capturing the knight on d5, assuming the black knight cannot recapture due to the pin. But this is the trap. Black captures the white knight anyway. If white then takes the queen with bishop captures on d8, black replies with bishop to b4. White is forced to play queen to d2, after which black plays bishop takes queen, king takes bishop, and now black is ahead in material with a much better position. It's a brilliant trap that punishes shallow calculation. Number 2 on our list, the England Gambit trap, a bold surprise that catches many unsuspecting d4 players. It starts with pawn to d4, and black immediately offers a pawn with pawn to e5. White grabs it with pawn takes e5, and black develops with knight to c6. White continues developing naturally with knight to f3, and black plays queen to e7. Then, white brings out the bishop with bishop to f4, and black immediately hits with queen to b4 check. White blocks with bishop to d2, but black snaps up the hanging pawn on b2. White plays bishop to c3, covering escape squares and preparing a trap, but black plays bishop to b4, pinning the defender. White tries to escape the pressure with queen to d2, but black captures the bishop takes c3. After white recaptures with queen takes c3, here comes the stunner. Queen to c1 checkmate. That's right, checkmate with the queen on move 8. This trap is flashy, unexpected, and shows how dangerous the England Gambit can be when white isn't careful. Finally, at number 1, we have the fishing pole trap, which is number 1 for 2 great reasons. First, you can play it very often, as it arises from the Ruy Lopez opening. And second, when it works, it's absolutely delightful. It begins with pawn to e4 and pawn to e5, then knight to f3 and knight to c6. White develops the bishop with bishop to b5, and black brings out the knight to f6. White castles with kingside, castling, and now here comes the bait. Black plays knight to g4, tempting white to attack. White pushes pawn to h3, and black plays the bold move pawn to h5, daring white to take the knight. White accepts with pawn takes g4, but now the trap springs to life. Black plays pawn to g4, white retreats with knight to h2, and black brings out the queen with queen to h4, eyeing danger. Then white tries to push with pawn to f3, but black goes all in with pawn to g3. White calmly plays rook to e1, but black has it all calculated. Queen takes h2 check. White is forced to move the king to f1, and now black finishes it off with knight to d4, bringing in reinforcements. White moves rook to e3, adding escape room for the king, and on the next move it's queen to h1 checkmate. A beautiful example of how a quiet knight on the edge of the board can lead to complete devastation. Those are 7 chess traps.